Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space. On January 20th, 2024, Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States. And there's already been plenty of massively influential stuff that he's done already, like withdrawing from the World Health Organization or pardoning the rioters who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And it has happened at such blistering speed, and I do intend to cover all of that in the near future. But today, I want to hone in on two specific political topics which will no doubt be a major focus for the upcoming 4 years. Immigration and how it relates to the Democratic Party's electoral strategy moving forward. Immigration is one of the policies where Trump is the most fervently right-wing. When he first started campaigning for president in 2015 and 2016, he campaigned on the idea that he would build a wall between the US and Mexico. When running for a second term, one of the main promises that Trump made would be the mass deportations of thousands of undocumented immigrants once he was sworn in as president. Now, why has Trump campaigned so hard on immigration? Well, one potential explanation is that immigration is much more politically unpopular for Democrats than many people have traditionally thought. In the past, one overriding explanation that many progressives had about minority voters, especially Latino voters, is that they were a lot more supportive of left-wing immigration policy. In effect, the thought was that if the Democratic Party moved further left, it could court more support from Latino Americans. And unfortunately, this theory has largely borne out to be untrue at this point. In an article written by staff writer Rajay Karma for The Atlantic, he outlined some of this reasoning and why it turned out to be untrue. To quote him, "For more than a decade, Democrats have struck an implicit electoral bargain. Even if liberal immigration stances alienated some working-class white voters, those policies were essential to holding together the party's multiracial coalition. That bargain now appears to have been based on a false understanding of the motivations of Latino voters. Part of the story is the rise of progressive immigration advocacy nonprofits within the Democratic coalition. These groups convinced party leaders that shifting to the left on immigration would win Latino support. The Democratic Party's embrace of these groups was based on a mistake that in hindsight appears simple, conflating the views of the highly educated progressive Latinos who run and staff these organizations with the views of Latino voters." End quote. This mistake that Rajay Karma mentions, conflating the views of progressive high-income Latinos with those of the median Latino voters, that may have cost Democrats last November's election. So joining me to talk about this issue and much, much more is Greg Sargent, a writer for The New Republic and the host of the podcast, The Daily Blast. I sat down with him last week, before Trump was formally inaugurated, and before he was sworn in and kicked off a new era of American politics. I spoke with Greg to better understand how the Democrats could process their defeats to better oppose Trumpism in the future. One more thing. I mentioned how this interview was recorded about a week ago, so I think it is important to note that there's quite a bit of dramatic irony here. Before the news cycle became blisteringly fast last Friday, we were all a little bit more in the dark about what Trump was going to do once he got sworn in. So I think some of the more outdated parts of my interview are still useful because they serve as a frame of reference both for how we expected or hoped things to go and how that compares to how fast the speed of change has become within the Trump administration and what that suggests about what they might do next. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed the interview. Greg Sargent, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Okay, I'm gonna start with a question that I think you would find interesting. What policies do you want Donald Trump to become? Like, what policies do you want Donald Trump to pass once he becomes president?
What do I want him to do?
Yes, what do you want him to do?
I want him to increase legal immigration, invest more in asylum seeking, legalize the 11 million undocumented immigrants here, keep and build on Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and investments in climate, raise the federal minimum wage. I don't think he's going to do any of those things, Andrew, but that's what I want him to do.
Okay. What do you see as like the best case plausible scenario for a second Trump administration?
So that's a tough question to answer. I think a lot of his immigration initiatives getting tied up in court, his deportations running into real logistical difficulties. I'm not going to dismiss the possibility that some kind of deal can be made on immigration. I can envision certain types of deals. I don't know if Trump or Stephen Miller would ever go for them, but you can actually envision something like reforms to asylum plus the Dreamers, legalizing the Dreamers. Trump just said recently he wants to legalize the Dreamers. So I mean, who knows? Maybe there's a deal there. I mean, I'm highly skeptical, to be clear, but that is something I'd like to see. I could see him being sensitive to the arguments from many House Republicans who have a lot of these climate investments now creating jobs in their districts. I could see Trump being sensitive to them and maybe kind of fiddling around with the Inflation Reduction Act rather than we're trying to completely cut off funds to it, which he seems to say he's going to do. I can see some kind of deal on the child tax credit, maybe. Maybe Trump doesn't repeal Biden's infrastructure law. Those are sort of things that could happen that would be a better outcome than one might expect.
Yeah.
What do you think, Andrew? What do you want him to do? What's a plausible outcome here that's not terrible in your view?
A plausible outcome. So I would echo some of you, like what you say is like some of the stuff that he tries to do gets very, very wrapped up in the bureaucracy.
Yes.
Yes. I think that, so one thing that David French said recently that I think actually sounds like a convincing argument is that like he's more worried about RFK than he is about Pete Hegseth. Not because like there is some like massive differential in terms of how dangerous they can be. It's more that like Pete Hegseth is a lot more wrapped into like a very, very bureaucratic organization with so many layers that you have to go through in a way such that that ends up mitigating the potential amounts of damage that he could do compared to like RFK, like on a pulpit in an official position in government, which has the potential to be much more dangerous.
It's funny you bring up RFK because talk about an area where really absolutely awful things could happen. That's it. I'm at this point operating from the assumption that he gets through. I really hope he doesn't. And if there's any nominee who has a chance of going down, it would be him and Tulsi Gabbard. Obviously, Pam Bondi as Attorney General appears to be getting through. Pete Hegseth appears to be getting through. I think there's still an outside shot at stopping RFK and Tulsi Gabbard, but not looking good.
Yeah. I guess then the question is, what do you see your role as a journalist like right now? So like right now, you write for the New Republic. You even host your own podcast called The Daily Blast. What do you see your role to be when it comes to like some of the potential dangers that might come from Trump in the upcoming months?
Well, I think one big thing that I really hope to do effectively is keep Democrats in line on some of this stuff. What we just saw happen today, hours ago, uh, Senate Democrats allowed the Laken-Riley Act, a very onerous, terrible immigration bill, to circumvent the filibuster to end debate, which means it's now going to pass. 10 Democrats voted for it to go forward. And this is a situation, Andrew, where they had the option of banding together and saying, okay, look, a number of us do want to support this bill because a number of Democrats do want to support the Laken-Riley Act. Fetterman, Gallego, Alyssa Slotkin, people like that, swing states, senators, they could have said, you amend this bill to exempt dreamers from it, exempt minors from it, fix other really serious problems with it. Otherwise, we don't give you the votes you need to get to 60. And they didn't do that. And I don't understand why. And it does not bode well for having a really strong Democratic opposition. So a big thing that I hope to do is to try and argue Democrats into being a little more effective as an opposition.
I guess then I'm kind of interested in what you think about immigration as an issue broadly, because I do largely agree with a lot of the commentators saying that like immigration is like unfortunately a very politically unpopular topic, and also that non-white voters are significantly less supportive of immigration than a lot of people previously thought. Like you actually linked to an article from Rajay Karma in The Atlantic, and I read that article while doing research for this, and I thought that he made a pretty convincing case that a lot of the time Democrats drastically overestimate how effective they can be when it comes to pushing through progressive immigration legislation. Do you dispute any of the stuff that he said, or are you simply trying to like understand what that means in practice?
So I do dispute that overall take very vigorously, yeah, for a number of reasons. I think it's probably true that the groups, as they're called, the immigration groups, did saddle Democrats with some unpopular positions in the 2019-2020 presidential primaries. I don't deny that. And I think we do have to rethink how a party like the Democrats would handle those types of litmus tests going forward. 100% there. But it's much more complicated. The story is much more complicated than just Democrats moved left. That made them vulnerable. For one thing, for the last 4 years, I strongly urge your listeners to read the new analysis by David Beyer at the Cato Institute. He went through the evidence very carefully, and he showed that it's just not true that Biden was lax on enforcement. It's just a fiction. It really isn't true. I can walk through some of the highlights for you real quick. Biden kept...
Yep. You think Rajay Karma was arguing that Biden was lax on enforcement during his time as president?
Well, so it's not entirely clear to me what he was arguing, other than, left-wing groups bad. They saddled Democrats with some positions that are bad, and that explains what happened, which, again, I don't deny that those groups are problematic, but the story is more complicated than that. Let me give you a piece of data.
Like the groups are like the people that claim to speak on behalf of like coalitions or demographics like Latino voters. Like they claimed to be representative of what the median Latino American might have thought.
Yeah, I don't know whether they're claiming that or not. I think that the groups have a much more complicated role. Our discourse has been really kind of hijacked by a certain type of centrist commentator who refuses to bring nuance to this discussion.
Do you think centrist commentators refuse to bring nuance to the immigration discussion?
As a general matter, I think sometimes there is a failure there. For instance, I think David Leonhardt has been really not very good on this issue. I think some of the Atlantic pieces were not good enough. I just want to stress this as clearly as I can. The groups did saddle Democrats with some unpopular positions in 2019 and 2020. I don't deny that. But the story is more complex than that. For instance, the exit polls showed that 56% of Americans favored a path to citizenship, whereas something in the low 40s favored mass deportations. Now, that indicates to me that Trump's position, maybe his most central campaign position on immigration is actually unpopular when voters are given a choice between it and a path to citizenship. So, has the electorate moved to the right on immigration? Maybe. I think maybe if you were to ask the median voter, do you want to see legal immigration at a higher rate or a lower rate or stay the same? Probably a majority would say stay the same or lower. But opinion on this issue is complex and conflicted. Voters also support a path to citizenship. They support making it easier for people to get asylum. I think Democrats honestly have to figure out a way to straddle the issue in a manner that speaks to people's desire for border security, which is real, but also speaks to people's desire to see legal immigration proceed in an orderly way for the good of the country, which is another real sentiment.
Would you reject the premise that anti-immigration sentiment helped Trump win his second term?
I don't really know how to answer that question the way you asked it. It's sort of too simplistic. I mean, is there a chunk of MAGA voters who were more energized by this issue than they might otherwise have been? Did more of them vote as a result of this issue? I think, yeah, probably.
But I guess what I'm trying to lead to is, do you think that there are a sizable contingent of swing voters that might have voted more Republican because of fears of more immigration?
I don't know. I just don't think we know that yet. And maybe we will eventually. It's very clear that the overriding issue was not immigration. It was the economy and inflation. Now, it's very hard to answer the questions that you're asking because they're sort of too narrow, right? I mean, we just don't really know whether in an election that didn't come in amid the post-COVID inflation shock and so forth, in an election that didn't have that factor in place, would immigration have decided it in Trump's favor? I mean, are you prepared to say that? I doubt you would be prepared to say that.
I would say that even if I'm not prepared to, I would say the way I would describe it is a low confidence yes. It's not a hill that I would be willing to die under, but I am currently, and I'm open to changing my mind, but my current inclination is that anti-immigration sentiment did swing more people towards Trump.
Well, but that's a different thing, right? The claim that anti-immigration sentiment moved some people to Trump doesn't answer whether it was enough for Trump to win.
Okay, I'm inclined to believe that even if it wasn't enough for Trump to win, it was large enough such that it could have been, if that makes sense.
Sure. Is it possible? Yes. But let me ask you this. This was a very close election. You don't deny that, right?
I don't deny that.
It was significantly closer than Biden's victory over Trump in 2020, right?
Yes.
Polls showed overwhelmingly that swing voters believed that inflation was an enormous problem to them and that it was the overriding issue for them in the campaign, right?
Yeah. Wait a minute. I agree with all of these. I guess the one,
but just to finish the thought, though, Andrew. So subtract the inflation from the post-COVID shock from the equation, and an electorate where 56% were in favor of a path to citizenship automatically elects Trump on immigration. I don't see how you could conclude that.
Okay, so I agree that Trump's win was narrow. But I think that we would be imprecise if we only said that it was narrow, because he did win every single swing state. The state that I grew up in, I grew up in New Jersey. In 2020, Trump lost that by 15 points. In 2024, he only lost by 5 points. How is that not a massive? Well,
so I mean, I don't know if you read Michael Podhorzer Weekend Reading. Do you?
No, but I listened to the episode of your podcast where you referenced him, so I'm guessing you're going to say the same thing that you said in your podcast.
Well, I feel like we don't really know exactly what happened. Honestly, I'm reluctant to say that I completely side with Michael's analysis, right? I'm reluctant to say in a blanket way that immigration wouldn't have decided for Trump. Right? Maybe it would have. I don't know. Maybe it would have, but it doesn't seem like. I mean, the shift to the right reflected differentials in turnout between the parties. It reflected inflation. I mean, I would point out that, as many have, that Harris's campaign moved the electorate significantly in their direction relative to the national swing, right? So, this is in places where Trump and Vance were hammering away at immigration day in and day out. So it's a little hard for me to see how that issue would have been decisive in those places. Look, I want to be clear. I think immigration on balance is a net negative for Democrats. I agree with that. I just think it's a complicated story. Biden was actually pretty tough on enforcement, right? In many ways. He isn't responsible for the surge that we saw, which was really driven by global factors. And the electorate is really deeply conflicted on the issue. I do think that there's been a move to the right on immigration, but it's just not that. It's not what David Leonhardt and Roger Karma say. It's just, I mean, do you really think that Kamala Harris's 2019 positions are what doomed her in this election? I don't think so.
But maybe they played like a significant contributing factor. Like, we can't rule that out.
Yeah, maybe. But I mean, there are a million different factors that influence the election. Here's the bottom line. The Biden-Harris agenda was not left-wing. It was not a left-wing immigration agenda. It was the opposite of a left-wing immigration agenda. Again and again throughout Biden's 4 years, the groups were actually sidelined on this issue. I can count.
So I know I already mentioned this, but I'm just going to repeat it one last time to just sear it into the audience's brain. The groups are like the progressive activists that claim to speak for people like Latino voters. Yeah.
Right. And I do think that Latino voters are conflicted. In fact, we have a big piece coming out that gets into some of this stuff in some detail. So you want nuance, I'm going to try and offer some. It should be out in the next month or so. I hope people will read it. It's about the Latino vote, and it touches on immigration. I don't doubt that some Latinos see border security as being a really important issue. I think it's obviously true. South Texas moved toward Trump. That's not something that any Democrat can just hand wave away. Those are real things. But I would point out that Donald Trump was president once before, and he implemented a restrictionist agenda. And I would remind your listeners that he was unpopular on the issue. If the electorate were restrictionist as a matter of course, why would Donald Trump's restrictionist agenda have been unpopular? I don't see why.
It's possible that it's like low salience unpopularity, if that makes sense. It's like sometimes like polls say that the average American believes something when in reality they don't really care that much, and they're just like filling out a piece of paper that pollsters told them to fill out.
I think that's a big part. I also agree with the analysts who see opinion on immigration as a thermostatic thing.
Yeah.
And there's a reason, like there's a deep structural reason.
Wait, explain what thermostatic means in this context.
So thermostatic, essentially, to make it simple, means that the voters develop opinions in reaction to who's in power. They swing against the grain of who's in power. So when Trump was president, they saw family separations, they saw bedlam at the border, they saw Remain in Mexico, they saw deportations, and they turned against that. When Biden was president, they saw disorder at the border, or they saw, they didn't see all the deportations he did, apparently, even though he did a lot of them. He did deport a lot of people, and they turned against him. And I think there's a deep structural problem that kind of works against Democrats here, which is that the public holds the party in power responsible for the disorder at the border, but it's really not a manageable issue as long as Congress doesn't supply the resources for it. You are going to have disorder, you're going to have suffering, you're going to have cruelty. It's not a manageable issue under current law and under current budgetary constraints. And so I think Democrats tend to pay a higher price for it when they're in power than Republicans pay for that when they're in power. You see what I mean? But it's like a structural problem. It's not that Democrats are too liberal. It's that the issue can't be managed under current conditions.
Yeah. Um, I want to return to something that you said earlier. So, like, when you were trying to explain why, like, the Democrats lost the 2024 election, one thing you said is that it's because of differences in turnout. Would you be willing to say that, like, in the present day, trying to increase voter turnout is nowadays harmful to Democrats because voter turnout tends to benefit Republicans more?
I mean, you're talking about the Nate Cohn analysis, which holds that high propensity voters favor Democrats now and low propensity ones favor Republicans.
Yeah.
I don't know. I buy that. I buy that mostly. But it sort of seems to me like it's kind of fluid, doesn't it? I mean, is that something that's really going to hold when a Republican is in power? I don't know.
Yeah.
I
So
mean,
like maybe it was true in 2024, but we don't know what will happen, like what how turnout will affect either party in 2028. Like that's what you're saying.
or even 2026, right? I mean, if there's deep dissatisfaction with Trump and unhappiness with the direction of the country, do low propensity voters still vote Republican at the same numbers that they did this time? Why do you think that will happen?
I don't yeah, so I don't think I don't I think that we don't know enough to know what will happen, but I do think that we know enough to know what did happen with regards to turnout last November. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, this was something that even the Biden people were admitting was a major problem for them as early as the spring. I had Jeff Pollack, who was one of the campaign's top pollsters, on our podcast, and he said exactly what Nate Cohn said, which is that the low propensity voters are a problem for us. This is not something that's a secret. It's not anything that Democrats deny.
Yeah. Maybe it used to be, but anyway, moving on.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think? So, like, you, we just argued for a little bit about the idea that immigration is not actually not that devastating for Democrats. But then I guess obviously Trump, he often campaigns on a lot of different issues. Like, what do you think are the most politically popular and most politically unpopular aspects of Trump's ideology, at least like the way that he tries to present himself to the public?
Can you be a little more specific with that question?
So you know how like everyone when they run for president, they say that they're going to do X, Y, Z when they become president. And Trump often campaigns on doing a lot of different types of things once he becomes president. So like which of his promises do you think helped him and which of his promises do you think hurt him or like were less popular?
Well, I think his promise to get prices down, obviously, which he's already said is going to be hard, by the way, I would point out. I think that was obviously a very popular thing. When I was doing some reporting on Latinos in central Pennsylvania, we have a piece coming out on that. I found that was like a constant thing where those voters just heard Trump telling them that he was going to get prices down. That's what they heard over and over and over. And it sank in. I think that was clearly a big one. I mean, I think the threats to jail all his opponents, I can't imagine those are popular.
Maybe those were like maybe they had a negligible effect. Maybe they were neither popular nor unpopular.
Right. I think that voters prioritized costs and the standard of living over any of the authoritarian stuff.
Yeah, or like threats to free speech or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're going to ask if those things are polled, I mean, look, I will say that I reported early on during the cycle that internal Democratic polling, or not internal, it was publicly released, that polling was finding that most swing voters, the really contested ones, were just simply not aware of Trump's most overt authoritarian threats. They just didn't know about them. And this was a problem that Democrats identified as far back as the spring or even early spring of 2024. And so it's a little hard to know exactly what the public thought about Trump's authoritarianism. But I don't think him saying the January 6th rioters are patriots and heroes resonates positively with the public, with any majority sentiment.
Yeah. Maybe it does not resonate strongly, but it is not like a disqualifier for them either. Like it's neither massively positive nor massively negative.
Right, and this is where the high propensity, low propensity voter schism maybe kicks in a little, because clearly in 2022 in those elections, that was a motivator. It did help Democrats win.
Yeah,
Right,
like
I think there's little doubt of that.
the Jan 6 committee might have actually helped Democrats in the 2022 midterms. Even if it was a small help, it was still a help. Yeah.
No question. I mean, remember the candidates that went down were election deniers mostly, at least in the statewide races.
Yeah.
Carrie Lake, who was a very dynamic, energetic figure, I thought she was going to win in 2022 in Arizona. I was absolutely convinced she was going to win. She seemed formidable, but she was sort of acting, and pundits were acting as if her election denialism wouldn't matter. But plainly it did. I mean, by how much, I don't know, but when you're talking about a race that was won by such a tiny margin as that Arizona race, gubernatorial contest, I should stress for listeners, that was the Arizona gubernatorial contest in 2022 that Carrie Lake lost. When a race fought, decided by such a very narrow margin, I mean, clearly, election denialism could have moved a critical number of votes.
What do you say? What would you characterize as the main motivations for people that used to be solidly Democrat and over the past few years, maybe starting with COVID or starting with 2022 or starting with 2024, like the people that used to be solidly blue and are now either swing voters or even Republican? What would you say are some of the motivations for people that have become more like red over time?
I mean, it depends on how large a time horizon you're talking about, but obviously cost of living is really one of the biggest ones. I mean, we're talking about young, low propensity voters and very low information voters, right? Aren't we? I mean,
like people that listen to like Jordan Peterson or whatever, right?
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, I'm not really talking about people like that. I'm talking about low propensity, non-white, young people who are really, really disengaged from politics. They get flushed into the electorate during presidential races, kind of. In this case, look, I think we got to concede that the Trump campaign made a big bet on those voters, and they did a pretty stunning job of reaching them. They did it through all sorts of methods that outmatched democratic communications, such as getting into these cultural spaces that were really non-political in many ways, really invading those spaces and grabbing hold of them in a way, and grabbing hold of voters in them. That was remarkable stuff. I think there's no question about it.
Yeah, I think younger voters basically saved Trump last November. Wow.
I think that's probably true, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very close.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
So I think that helped. I think the way I would describe people that used to be Democrat and became more right-wing over time, I think COVID and wokeness, I've mentioned this before, but I would say those were also two like large factors in getting them to become more right-wing. Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm skeptical of the wokeness theory. But I know that I'm swimming upstream here, and it's not possible to get anyone to even, entertain an alternate narrative. I mean, I would point out that in 2022, a lot of the anti-woke candidates lost in statewide races. And in fact, I believe in one of the Senate races, was it Michigan? The Republican candidate explicitly said, we lost because we overemphasized trans issues. There was a memo from Republicans who said that.
Well, that's the difference between like midterms and presidential races is that.
Yeah. No, I buy that. I think that's true. But a whole bunch of school board candidates backed by the Moms for Liberty people lost. And by the way, I would point out that Democrats regained a great amount of ground in the Virginia races, state legislative races in 2023. We were told endlessly that Governor Glenn Youngkin's win in 2021 proved that wokeness was an absolute disaster for Democrats. 2 years later, they regained much of the space, campaigning against book bans, and suddenly the pundits who pointed out that Youngkin's win meant something were quiet. I don't know why. They had nothing to say about the complete reversal of that narrative.
I just wanted to say I really missed arguing with you. Um, the,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, can you talk a little bit about um could you talk a little bit about some of the main grievances you hear from like Trump supporters nowadays? Like what would you say are like the main things that they rally against or like are like the main drivers for their continued support for Trump?
I mean, I really hesitate to try to speak for Trump voters, but just based on what they say, when I try to listen a lot to a lot of what they say, I mean, obviously they're still mad that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump. They believe the FBI is going after conservative parents. That's false. Didn't happen. They campaigned on it as if it were true. They seem to want mass deportations, except in communities where they rely on migrant labor. By the way, that's another thing that's worth looking at and
Yeah,
talking
well,
about.
we can talk about that right now if you want. Do you want to explain the H-1B controversy between Elon Musk and the New Right?
Oh, sure. Well, so Elon Musk represents the tech position, which is in favor of high skilled immigrant visas.
Yeah, and like traditionally, the tech sector has been in favor of immigration because it helps them and helps their economic performance.
Helps their economic performance, and I think there's a real worldview there as well. And I think there's a real worldview on the right populist side, which I can get into. But yes, so I think they also genuinely believe that dynamic, energetic, entrepreneurial individuals from around the world coming to America is good for the country. Obviously, it's partly about their bottom line and their workforces, but they have a real view of what's good for America. I mean,
Yeah,
if you
like
look at
it's easy for them to like choose the more morally upright position because it also benefits their bottom lines at the same time, so they can believe both with no cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true. But they really do, I think, believe that it's better for the country. And I believe it's better for the country. And so the right populist side, represented most prominently by Steve Bannon, who has gone with a sledgehammer after Musk. He's gone pretty aggressively at him. His position is that this is just, it's all a scam, as he put it. It's a way for quote unquote globalist corporations to avoid the responsibility to hire American workers. And here's where there's a real worldview as well. They think, the right populists believe, that this relieves the American society of the obligation to empower American workers to fill some of these roles that are very lucrative and rewarding. And that's a real view. Bernie Sanders has it. That's his view. It's not just nativism. It's not just xenophobia. It's an actual view about the duty of American society to American workers. And
Like they would believe that like immigrants would end up stealing jobs that could have been gone to like native born Americans.
right, but there's also a view of what society's obligation to American workers is as well, lurking in the background, right? They think that if we rely on foreign skilled labor, we're relieved as a society of the obligation to invest the resources necessary to get American workers into a position where they can fulfill or fill these roles, which are very rewarding and lucrative. You see what I mean? It's an actual view. I mean, that's Bernie Sanders' view. It's not something you can just dismiss.
Yeah. Do you think David Leonhardt has a similar view?
I don't really know. I mean,
I'd love to see you get him on your podcast. That would be fun.
Yeah, I guess that could be fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look, he is a very accomplished reporter. He's written a very highly regarded book on this topic, and well, it's one of the topics in the book. He, you know, he has a view of this. I think his view is not sufficiently nuanced and complex.
Yeah.
It's a complicated world, and his view doesn't, I think, capture the complexities of the issue.
Yeah, but if you're lucky enough, maybe you can raise those questions to him on your podcast. Yeah. Next question. So you've spent so much time covering many and many of the different like horrifying features of Trumpism. How do you do that in a way that's both precise and in a way that like avoids burnout or fatigue from you?
Who says I'm avoiding burnout and fatigue?
Yeah, maybe you can like take a break and talk about like effective altruism or something else. Yeah.
That sounds even more irritating than Trumpism, actually.
Okay.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, look, I think that people who are writing about politics from a liberal perspective are going to have to focus hard on, look, liberalism has taken a beating. We were wrong about a bunch of things. I fully admit that I underestimated Trump's political appeal. I don't think it's a contradiction to say that, and also to say that external factors really maybe made the election unwinnable for Democrats. I think those
external factors like the remnants from COVID or like Biden, like poor debate performance.
Well, I think, look, I think I regret, I said this publicly, I regret that I underestimated the problem that Biden's age posed. I think that's right. They were the critics who pointed that out early. I think some of them maybe had different motives for making the point, but they were right about it.
Yeah, like Ezra Klein was right. Yeah.
Well, so, okay, this is where it gets a little complicated, right? Because I think the most correct position, right? I'm not saying I had this position, but I think the most correct position was to wait and see how Biden did up until the spring. I think it was reasonable for people to pause before kicking him out, right? I forget when did the debate first start? Around in the winter.
I think
right?
it was late May, if memory serves me. It was either late May or June.
That's the debate, though, right? So
the debate, that was the debate, is what I mean.
Right, but right. So sorry. The argument over whether Biden should stay in started earlier. It started around the beginning of 2024, and I think the right position at that point was not to push him out. That said, he should have realized that he wasn't going to be able to do this thing, and
he should have pushed himself out because he had it
even earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, his whole rationale for running the first time was that he was going to be the bridge to a future generation of Democrats. If he had actually fulfilled that declared mission, he could have very easily just said, after the 2022 midterms, he could have said right then, I'm passing the torch. And putting aside the debate over whether there should have been an open process or whether it would go to Harris, it's a little hard for me to see how it wouldn't go to Harris, right? But putting aside that debate, I think if Biden had done that after the 2022 midterms, Democrats would have had a better shot. I'm not sure it was winnable, to be clear. Do you think it was winnable?
I think it was winnable if Joe Biden had announced like immediately after the 2022 midterms that he would not seek another term. I think if that happened, then it was winnable.
And it's a maybe, right?
Yeah. But like the maybe gives Democrats a much higher chance that they ended up having last November.
Much higher? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it was almost certainly going to be Harris. Can you see a scenario where it's not Harris?
If they had committed to doing an open primary very early on.
But how do you do that? I mean, it would be a fairly major break with precedent. How would you justify it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the point, just to finish my concession here, I think I was wrong when I concluded. I didn't conclude it, but I was wrong when I reached the sort of understanding, the tentative understanding that it was premature to worry about Biden's age. However, I don't think it was right to push him out at that point in the winter of 2024. I think the correct position then was to give him a chance, because after all, he's the sitting president. He says he wants to run. It's not easy for Democrats to just shrug at that and throw him aside. And so at that point, you give him the chance and look, it shouldn't have been so hard to get him out after the debate performance. But the point is, so Ezra was prescient on this, but does that mean that the right position then was that Biden should have gotten out in the winter of 2024? I don't think so. I don't see why.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Does it?
You're saying that like we're approaching early 2024 with hindsight bias, essentially. Like,
well, no, I mean, it was unreasonable to expect him to get out then, or to expect the Democratic Party to go through pushing him out. I mean, think of it like this. Look how hard it was to push him out after that debate performance, that disastrous debate performance. Do you think it would have been possible to push him out in early 2024? It would have literally been like the bloodiest brawl you can possibly imagine, and it wouldn't have worked. It might have actually made it less likely that he got out later.
This also is like, we didn't like how hard it was to push Biden out after the first debate. We did not know that it was going to be that hard, in the same way that we did not know Biden's condition.
Oh, that's true. I just still think it was sort of unreasonable to expect Biden to either step down in early 2024 or to expect the Democratic Party to go through the convulsions necessary to push him out. This is not an easy thing.
Yeah.
It would have been much easier on everyone, and I regret not noticing this or thinking this at the time, although did anybody? I don't know. It would have been much easier if right after 2022 he had said he wasn't running.
Yeah. Yeah, so to circle back to the question that I asked, yeah, so what are some ways that you try to deal with like not feeling burnout from just like covering Trumpism over and over again?
I don't know. Try to read decent books. What do you do? I mean, you must be kind of burned out as well. I mean, you podcast on this stuff.
I podcast on this stuff, but I try to like vary my topics. So sometimes I'm accurately describing Trumpism. Sometimes I'm talking about social media. Sometimes I'm talking about AI or effective altruism or gender polarization or many of the myriad other important political topics. So like that means that when I come back to Trumpism, I have the energy to give it the amount of like moral fervor that it deserves. Or at least that's what I'm trying to do.
I like that. I like that approach a lot. It's a little hard to take your eyes off the ball, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It'll be especially hard once the presidency starts.
But it's like take your eye off the ball in like very select times so that once you get your eye back on the ball, you can hit it well and then go back to like talking about other stuff. Like find the balance such that like when you are talking about it, everyone is crystal clear about how bad the situation is. And then when you aren't talking about it, you're talking about things that are also important and also give you a little bit of a breather. That's what I try to do.
Yeah, well, it's a very wise approach. Another thing one could do is talk a little bit more about the future of the Democratic Party and the future of liberalism, which we're going to have a big conversation about.
Yeah, where do we want to be? Do you think, like, what do you think is the okay? One of my last questions. What do you think is the ideal Democratic position on immigration? Like, what do you think that, like, do you think that they should basically say, like, I want strict border security, but I also want like a path to citizenship for people that like come to the country illegally? Is that what you think they should say?
So yes to that, but I think the essential added ingredient is that Democrats should be for broader legal pathways for getting here. What Democrats should be saying more of, and they kind of said this, but not nearly emphatically enough, is, look, immigration properly managed is good for the country. We need more of it. We can run it effectively. We just need the resources. And maybe look, if the asylum process is getting really too screwed up, we can sort of try to shift incentives towards bringing in people in a more orderly way from afar, to kind of, I don't know, siphon off the asylum flow a little bit, which is what the administration tried to do with the parole programs and so forth. But I think Democrats should be saying more clearly, we can do this. We can bring in more people in an orderly way that genuinely benefits the country while also keeping the border secure. In fact, they kind of reinforce each other. If you give people pathways to enter, they don't try to get in illegally. So I'm not pretending that's an easy argument to make in the intensity of a campaign. It's hard, but what they're currently doing isn't working clearly. And so, look, the New York Times had a big editorial laying out this approach. The editorial didn't say that was clearly enough that that's the actual Democratic position. But the Times editorial is pretty good.
Greg Sargent, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
No problem, Andrew. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.